welcome to the Marriage Adventure Podcast. We are your hosts, Daniel and Bonnie Hoover, and we're glad that you're joining us today and listen to our conversation. And today we are just going to kind of jump right in, and we've been talking in the past about some stuff about communication and all of that, but this goes a little deeper than that, I guess.
Yeah, it kind of deals with communication, but almost how we communicate with ourselves before we communicate together, right? And so, it's the ability to communicate or the inability to communicate, I really think, leads to a ton of conflict in marriages. A lot of people say, man, we need to be better at resolving conflict. Well, in reality, if we were better at communicating, we might not get in that conflict anyway, because what is communication? Communication is your ability to express your thoughts and feelings in such a way that I can hear them, and it's my ability to listen, because listening is a big part of communication, listen to your thoughts and feelings and take them in and process them.
And understand them better.
But I think the problem is we're terrible at communicating our thoughts and feelings because emotions get involved in a way. But we're also terrible at listening to understand. I think we listen to win.
Well,
but we don't
I'm
listen to understand.
If I'm listening to understand you, then I can't be thinking ahead to how I can rebut your arguments.
That's right. And if you listen to understand me, then you might not win the thing at hand and try to get the upper hand. And so all that's baked into communication. If we can learn to communicate and listen and talk and share what we're thinking and all in such a way it can be heard, and I can take in information in such a way that I want to understand you and what you're thinking, then man, our conflict's going to be way less, isn't it?
I'll say this. I think now that we've been married, 27 years, we are way better at it now than we were when we first got married. We did not have any concept of this.
A turtle is better at it now than when we first got married.
I mean, and I think we both approached communication so different that it was night and day. We just didn't know how to communicate with each other. I mean, and settle anything of any importance. We got along so well because we had such common views, but the minute we disagreed on something, we didn't know what to do with it.
No,
we
sure didn't.
Because, and I'll just say this, and we may have shared this before, but your idea of an argument was, we're going to get it all out on the table and we're going to handle all this right now.
Dang it.
Yep.
And it was done with that kind of forceful, no, we're doing this now.
And I did not know what to do with that because I felt like the animal backed in a corner that doesn't know how to get away and just starts clawing and spitting and growling. And so when I would be faced with the push of, you want to know the depths of my heart or whatever, or we're going to get into this, I'm like, I don't know what to say to you, so I start saying mean things, and it wasn't good communication at all.
Either that or you would retreat. And I thought you were stuffing and running. And I'm like, no, we need to deal with this. Right? The Bible says we need to do this before it gets dark out. It's almost dark out. and so I think we also need to preface that we're kind of making it sound like having conflict in marriage is bad. Conflict isn't bad. Conflict leads to a deeper understanding of each other. I mean, you get makeup sex, right? You don't get makeup sex if you don't have conflict. No. But it's how we handle conflict.
Yep.
And I've heard this said that you can gauge the health of a marriage by how quickly a couple can move through conflict to resolve it and forgive. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think we've seen that in our own marriage.
But I think one of the things we struggled with was we didn't understand what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
We didn't have an understanding that we process things differently. It's not just that we communicate differently. we process our own emotions in completely different ways. And for me to be able to communicate with you well about what I'm thinking, I've got to process first what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And that was where I would get stuck, because you want to get it all out. You're one of these people who can think on the fly. You are really good at shooting from the hip. I'm not. If I know I've got to, if we're going to, just for instance, if we're going to be speaking somewhere, if you get in the moment, you can just shoot from the hip, and with very little, I mean, you prepare, but you've got, your outline looks like 3 bullet points. Mine looks like a manuscript.
3 pages. Yeah.
Because I have to really mull it over and get all the things out so that I don't misspeak, because I really need to process them like that. And you can process on the fly. And so that's how we were trying to take those 2 different communication styles of processing our emotions and our thoughts towards a topic, and we were trying to do that in the same conversation, and it wasn't working.
No. And that's kind of what you were saying we experienced earlier in our marriage, and a few times throughout we'll forget. So it's important to understand how you and your spouse both process information, and it can help you formulate, proper communication. Because improper communication leads to those fights that you don't remember what you fought about the next day. I don't know what we fought about. There was about 100 things that came in. So basically, as we dive in, there's 2 types of people in the world. For today's podcast, we're going to say there's internal processors and there's external processors. And sometimes in marriage, you get 2 of the same.
Yep.
But a lot of times in marriage, you get 1 of each. And the external processor will talk to think, while the internal processor will think to talk. Let me say that again.
Yeah, say that again.
The external processor will talk to think. That's very much me. While the internal processor will think to talk. That's very much
me.
You.
Yep, that makes sense.
So, in other words, one, me, talks to formulate their thoughts. And then the other thinks to formulate their thoughts. So go back to what you said. If we have to teach, I have my outline that looks like 3 bullet points. But what I've done to prepare is I have to get away by myself and verbally run through it out loud. And I don't just run through it. Like I'll do this. Like if we're teaching something, a scripture, different stuff, I'll do the study time to get all my notes. But I'll pull together all those notes and all those written things by verbally processing it out loud.
And then on the flip side of that, I'm not as so much let's run through it out loud as I want to write it all down and read through it until I've memorized it. And I think through it before I speak it. So that makes sense.
If you notice when we're writing or we're working on an outline or we're working on something that we're going to be presenting, you sit on the couch with your notebook. And what do?
You go and talk.
I walk around the room and talk with you about it. And that's how I process all of that. And it probably has driven you crazy before. No. So neither way.
As long as you don't make me do that.
That's right. Neither way is better than the other. But when we can understand the way our spouse processes information, it really helps in promoting effective communication. And but when there's a disconnect in understanding the way others around you process that information, it can really lead to frustration and anger. And that's what really happened early in our marriage. Is I wanted to have it out and talk about it, and I many times forced you to talk about something before you were ready to talk about it.
Yeah, and a lot of times we would get into that, and I would say things I didn't mean because I was just trying to win, which was bad strategy too. I was trying to win, and so I would push back in unhealthy ways. But if it reached the point where it boiled over and I'm like, I'm just mad and I left the conversation altogether, if I would go spend time with the Lord and I would sit down and I would go and journal and I would sit down and think through it, 9 times out of 10, I would come back and have to say, I really didn't mean what I said when I said that. And I would most of the time even agree with you, but I had not had time to process it in a way that I could get to that conclusion because I was really feeling pressure.
Do you feel like I was pushing you to do a a presentation in school before you were ready?
Absolutely.
Before you had your homework done?
And I'm one of those, I don't like to speak out of ignorance.
Right.
And I feel stupid if I don't have all my facts together and I don't know what I'm talking about. So I don't want to get into this until I know how I feel about it.
And you don't do that verbally. You do that.
I do that
internally.
Yeah, I'm an internal processor.
Yeah. So
I organize my thoughts in my head.
Right.
Before it comes out of my mouth.
Right. So probably if you're listening today, you've already identified which one you are and which one your spouse is. So, and I think it's important for us to understand our kids too, because this goes into parenting as well. What are our kids?
Josie is an external processor like you, and Colby, I think, is an internal processor like me.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Because Colby will talk about things.
But he needs
a minute.
Yeah, he needs a minute.
So let's talk about things to be aware of if you're an external processor. If you're an external processor, this doesn't mean that you can say anything that pops into your mind. Keep in mind, if you're an external processor and you're in the middle of communicating with your spouse, or maybe it's heightened to an argument, you're processing it. So meaning you're formulating your thoughts and ideas. So it may be that you need to pause on communicating with your spouse and go process this externally somewhere else. It may mean that you need to go for a walk or a run. Man, I'm telling you, for 40 years of my life, I ran a lot.
Yeah.
Or 30 years of my life I ran a lot. And I solved all the world's issues running on pavement. And I would verbalize as I'm running. I'm talking to myself. Those people driving by probably thought I was crazy. But, I mean, I would formulate my thoughts and I would, be able to process it.
And if it didn't involve me and I was running with you, you would process out loud other issues. I remember you doing that.
Yep. And that's when it's a good running pace is when you can talk but not sing.
Oh, okay.
Yes. That's kind of a side, but a good running pace is you can still talk, but you can't sing. But this doesn't mean that you can just say anything that pops in your mind, right? And Scripture says that in James 1:19, it says, "Dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry." So what does that say? Even if you're an external processor, you still need to listen. You still need to take in the information. It doesn't just give you the right to not listen and pop off with stuff. So we need to be quick to listen, slow to speak. So you're still listening, you're still taking in, but you can process verbally. You may just need to process verbally away from your spouse. Now, be careful who you process to.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. You may just, sometimes for me, processing verbally just means I'm speaking into the air. I'm not speaking to anyone. But I formulate my thoughts by speaking out loud.
Well, and I'll say what you said is a good thing, too, that when you're processing to the wrong person, because you're processing out loud, that might be held against you if it's to the wrong person. And and it's not even really your thoughts. You're just saying these things out loud until you figure out what your real position is on something. But if you're talking to the wrong person, and that gets back around and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I let that out.
Well, there's so many things it can be that you've processed to the wrong person and it gets back around, or you've processed to the wrong person, maybe of the opposite sex, and it deepens a relationship that doesn't need to happen. So I mean, there's so many things. So you can external process by yourself. You don't have to do that with somebody. And then also another thing you need to be aware of is you still need good listening skills. So that doesn't mean, and that's one thing, growing up, as awesome as my family was, we just were terrible communicators. And you just kind of smiled and shook your head. Was that in agreement?
I'm not saying anything.
We didn't.
I don't talk about your family. You don't talk about mine.
We didn't listen.
No.
And I mean, at the dinner table, man, it's one person's talking to the other person's talking to the other, and the volume keeps getting up.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd cut somebody off in the middle of a story, and so we just weren't. And I remember when I went to get my master's in counseling, you thought it was the funniest thing that I had to go pay somebody to teach me how to listen.
It was quite thrilling.
So Proverbs 18:13 says, "To answer before listening, that is a folly and a shame."
Mm-hmm.
Let me read that again. To answer something before listening is a folly and a shame. So we still need to develop really good listening skills. So, Bonnie, tell us about internal processors.
Well, I can speak for those and say that we're much less likely to get in the middle of a conversation with other people as I'm working through information or a problem in my head. It's like I'm not wanting to talk about it until I'm comfortable. I've stewed over it enough, and we've had time. I've had these processors. We've had time to think through the information. And an internal processor usually needs time to be able to play through scenarios in their head before they can make an opinion or decision.
So you're not caught off guard, so you feel prepared for whatever scenario comes your way.
Right. It's like if it goes this way, this is how I handle it. If it goes this way, I have an answer for everything.
Yeah.
And I'm already ready to know what I'm going to say, because in conversation, obviously communication is living, and it doesn't just follow the path you think it's gonna. That's why some people like to write a letter to somebody so they can get it all out, and it doesn't change directions on them in mid-stroke.
You stay on topic.
You stay on topic. So they're able to, without seeing many puzzle pieces, they're unable to see the whole puzzle, which delays their ability to make an opinion or decision.
So that is one thing that it's, if you think of it kind of like a fire that's a small ember and flame. In an argument, if you want that ember and flame to grow and you want that conflict to grow, we do that by taking kindling from past arguments and past issues and throwing it on there. And so when we don't stay on topic, it's usually because we're going and we're grabbing something to throw from the past on that fire, one, so we can win. So I can win this argument, because now it's become an argument. I'm not seeking to just listen and understand your heart. I want to win.
Yeah.
And so that fire just blazes out of control, and that's how we don't solve anything, because we've fought about a million things, and half of them were 5 years ago or 3 years ago or last month. And so writing it out or finding a way to stay on task is really important, and not bring
kind of
other
following
things
an
into
agenda,
it.
like a meeting agenda, so to speak.
Yeah.
Well, and another thing about internal processors is that they're likely to come up to their, come to their own decision without processing it with someone else. It's like they're likely to mull it over in their head, and they've already made their decision on something, and once they make that decision, they don't always feel like it's necessary to discuss it or even tell anybody how they got there. And I can see that. I can see that in myself, that
so you're set. Your mind's set.
My mind's set, and that can be a downfall. I mean, in some ways it's good, and in some ways it's bad. But I know that there are times that I'll sense the Lord is dealing with me in an area, and maybe I'm feeling called to do something, but I don't tell you right away, because I want to spend days, weeks, maybe even months hashing it out, praying in my prayer closet with the Lord to make sure that the Lord is convincing me of it, rather than you convincing me of it or talking me out of it. So, because I know sometimes I can be led to be persuaded. And if it's something that I sense the Lord pricking my heart in it, I need to know that it's from the Lord. And once I've made up my mind, I'll say, hey, I really feel like God's telling me to do this, because I know you're going to encourage me and say, yeah, you ought to do that. But if it's just a random thought I had, I don't want you talking me into something that God has not told me to do. So,
well, and as an external processor, there are times that I'm talking to you about something, and I've noticed, and you've noticed this too, we've talked about it. But I'm just doing, I'm just throwing spaghetti on the wall.
The what if conversation.
It's the what if conversation. And
what if
throwing spaghetti on the wall? That's a illustration we use. But if you've never heard of that, if you're cooking noodles on the stove, the old thing if you could tell they were done if you could take one and throw it against the wall and it's stuck. If it's stuck, then the noodle's done. If it slid off the wall, then they need to cook a little bit more in the boiling water. And then you're left having to wipe your walls down because they have marks. So a lot of times when I'm communicating out loud with you, I'm just throwing spaghetti against the wall, kind of processing it, thinking through options and what ifs and all. And one thing we struggled with for a long time was you thought I had decided it, because that's the way you process. When you come, you're usually, hey, this is what I want to do. And I'm just like, man, I don't know. What do you think about this? And blah, blah, blah. And
I would either shut down and not talk about it and get really quiet, or I'd start shooting down ideas.
Yes, immediately the wet blanket, or you would shut down, or you'd get this low level anxiety that would just start to kind of gradually creep up, because you're like, oh my gosh, we can't rent the space shuttle. I mean, we don't have money to do all this stuff, all this ideas, and now you just kind of you listen to them.
Well, because and a lot of times now you will say, hey, I'm just throwing this out there. This is not something I've decided. You usually start it like that. I'm just dreaming. You're just say, I'm just dreaming. Don't go getting scared on me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, I can listen and I can just kind of let you process out loud. And so.
Yeah. So what does our listener need to be aware of if they are an internal processor? If they're like you, what are some things they need to think through or be aware of?
Well, maybe one negative, if you're an internal processor, you need to be aware of this, that you probably hate conflict. So you might use your thinking time as an excuse to escape the argument. And that's not healthy. If you are using that as a way out of the conversation and never finding your way back into it, that's not a fair communication tactic. It's saying, well, I just need time to think about this, but really you're running away from it. Ephesians.
So a good way to do that is when you take that pause and say, hey, I need to think about this. If you can remember, set a time to come back to the conversation. Hey, can we talk about this tomorrow morning over breakfast? Or can we talk about this tonight over dinner? I need to think about this.
Yep. In Ephesians 4:26 says, be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your anger. Now, a lot of people have taken that to say you can't, we've got to stay up all night till we solve this problem. But that's when we get in the worst. I mean, when you're tired and you're not thinking clearly, then things really can go south. That I don't suggest that. So, but you need time to process things, but do it in a timely manner. The spirit of that verse is come back and solve it. So don't just use your thinking time as a way to run away. You still need to solve things in a timely manner.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I like that verse says, it lets us know it's okay to be angry.
Yeah.
It says be angry.
Sure.
Just don't sin in your anger. So.
And I'd say another thing you got to watch out for is when you're alone with your thoughts. Don't let your mind go to places that aren't truth, because sometimes we can create scenarios that aren't real. And I've done that. I've created in my mind, you're late, so you're dead in a ditch kind of thing, But it's if you're an internal processor, and don't be alone with your thoughts way too long, and make sure you're having healthy things that you're thinking on as you're doing that, scripture, and maybe seek some godly counsel, or just make sure that your heart's bent towards truth and not towards a negative reality.
That's good. All right, so as we wrap, what if you and your spouse process differently? And so the challenge is to have balance and work together to process the information, because I don't need you to be an external processor. I need you to be who God created you to be. I need to embrace that. And at the same time, I need to be an external processor and not an internal processor. That's the beauty of how God created us and created us to be together. But we do need to have some balance in that and work together to help each other process it in that way, so that you can utilize your strengths and be the best you that you can be, and vice versa for me. And I think over the years, that's something that we've had to learn. Is I've had to learn that you process this way, I process this way. And so, so I think one good thing is, and I think this is always good when we're talking about things like this, is if your spouse doesn't listen to the podcast, have them listen to this episode, shoot them the episode. And that way you both have a mutual understanding of the language and the different, that you're both different processors. And then you can it's an easy way to say, hey, heard this podcast, check it out when you have a moment. And I'd love, maybe we can talk about it or see what you thought about it or something over dinner. So,
well, and another thing would be, if you're different, external processors might need to be patient with the internal processors and give them a little bit of space to think. It's like, just recognize that, okay, they do want to talk to me. They're not running, but if I press too hard right now, they're going to be pushed to say things that they don't really mean. It's going to cause more conflict and probably take rabbit trails that are unrelated just for the sake of getting out of the conversation or winning or whatever. Give them a little space to breathe. And that might be helpful.
Everything they're saying out loud is not the gospel truth. They haven't worked this out in their head yet. They're just processing.
Yep. And what about internal?
I think the internal processor may need to engage in conversation before they're ready. If we push them, they're going to have to engage in conversation before you're ready to. So if you're an external processor, do not push in the moments they don't want to be pushed. I remember doing that, and you warned me. You said, hey, I'm not ready. This is not a good time to talk about this. And I pushed, maybe because I was, whatever, and I regretted it.
Well, and I did too, because I said really, and I had to go back and reclaim some words and say those weren't right.
And that's another good thing is, don't use the old manipulative, well, you said it.
Yeah.
External processor, if you push your internal processor to something before they're ready, then they're probably going to say things that they don't mean. And I remember you would come back a day or two later and you'd say, hey, listen, I said something and I didn't mean it. And this happened a year or so ago.
Yeah.
And so don't say, well, you said it, I'm sorry. Be gracious. We all need grace, as we constantly say on the podcast. And allow them to make amends and say, I'm sorry, and forgive them, and then listen to what God has told them.
Well, and recognize that they don't hold that against them to say, no, you said. Realize they really didn't mean it. It was just,
listen, if we're all held
the heat of the moment.
If we're all held to every word we say in the heat of the moment, then we're all terrible people.
Yep.
So, but it requires give and take, combined with a knowledge of how those around you or your spouse in particular process informations, and not just information, but feelings and thoughts, because that's all wrapped in the information. And so when we acknowledge the needs of our spouse, we're more likely to be patient and work together as a team, which can lead to more effective communication in your marriage. Yep. And this goes, I think, with parenting, and with all sorts of relationships, friends, people you work with, different things like that. So, think we're good?
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
I got nothing else to process out loud.
All right. Well, hey, listen, thanks so much for listening today. And if you're on Facebook or Instagram, check us out at The Marriage Adventure. And this podcast is also on our YouTube channel at The Marriage Adventure. And we look forward to our time together next time.